You have probably been cold before. Not uncomfortable, not "I need a jacket" cold. The kind of cold where your hands stop working properly, where simple tasks take longer, where thinking becomes slower, not because you panic, but because your body is quietly reallocating resources. Now imagine making decisions in that state, because that is where the winter of 1835 begins. Not with snow, but with misjudgment. Here is the historical problem. Mountain men were not amateurs. They were not settlers caught unprepared, nor travelers surprised by weather. They were professional trappers, guides, and hunters who spent years living beyond the edge of settlements. Men who understood cold, isolation, and scarcity better than almost anyone alive. And yet, in the winter of 1835, a disproportionate number of them died. Not in storms, not in avalanches, not in dramatic accidents. They died quietly, far from one another, in camps that should have worked. This is what makes that winter historically interesting. Because if men like these failed, the cause was not bravery or toughness or lack of skill. It was a breakdown of systems. The systems that had kept them alive in previous winters, movement timing, food storage, camp placement, heat management, and assumptions about weather patterns, stopped aligning with reality. The winter arrived early, not catastrophically, but early enough to close mountain passes before men had repositioned. Snow sealed high valleys while rivers were still expected to remain usable. Game shifted its patterns just enough to break established hunting logic. Individually, none of this was fatal. Together, it was. Now, step into it. You are wintering in the Rocky Mountains. There is no town nearby, no resupply, no calendar that matters beyond daylight and darkness. Your survival depends on experience, on what worked last year and the year before that. You wake before sunrise in a temporary winter camp. This is not a log cabin. Mountain men rarely built those unless they planned to stay for months. This shelter is meant to block wind, not cold. Poles, brush, hides, and packed snow pressed against a slope to create a shallow pocket of still air. Your breath hangs in the air longer than it should. That is not a feeling, it is information. The fire has burned down more than expected during the night. You rationed wood carefully, assuming you would gather more today. Wood is everywhere in the mountains, until it is buried, frozen, or too wet to burn efficiently. Heat is already costing more than it should. Outside, the mountains are quiet in a way that does not match the season. No birds, no running water. Even the wind moves differently, sliding low through timber instead of lifting over ridges. This winter is not behaving like previous ones. You stayed high too long. Not out of arrogance, out of habit. In other years, the snow came later. Passes stayed open longer. There was margin built into the system. The winter of 1835 removed that margin. When you step outside, the snow takes your boots deeper than yesterday. Not dramatically, just enough to make each step cost slightly more energy. That change is easy to ignore. Most men did. Moving downslope is the correct decision, but already slower than expected. Timber is heavier with snow. Open ground is scoured into hard crusts that hide ice beneath. Routes you relied on last year now consume more time, more heat, more effort. Nothing has gone wrong yet. That is why this winter killed experienced men. They did not recognize failure as it was happening. Each decision made sense on its own. Each adjustment felt temporary. The danger was not a single mistake, but a series of reasonable choices that no longer added up. By the time that became clear, movement itself had become a liability. The mountains did not trap them all at once. They let them continue, until leaving was no longer possible.
You begin to understand that food is no longer the primary limit. That realization comes slowly, and it feels counterintuitive. Hunger has always been the obvious threat in winter. You have measured seasons by meat dried, fat rendered, and traps set ahead of the freeze. That logic still matters, but it is no longer the bottleneck. The real constraint is energy conversion. How much effort it takes to turn landscape into calories. How much heat is lost in the process. How much time daylight allows you to fail before you must stop. You follow sign along the edge of a timbered flat where game should pass through. The tracks are there, light, spaced, not panicked. Animals are moving, just less often and less predictably. They are conserving energy the same way you are. This changes the math of hunting. In earlier winters, persistence paid off. You could range wider, follow sign longer, knowing that success would offset the cost. Now, every failed pursuit drains more than it returns. A half-day spent tracking with no result is not neutral. It is a loss you must absorb elsewhere. You shorten your hunts. This is the second broken assumption. Mountain men relied on opportunistic efficiency, taking game when the land presented it rather than forcing outcomes. In deep winter, that balance collapses. Waiting costs heat. Searching costs calories. Success becomes rarer precisely when it matters most. You set traps closer to camp, even though you know the ground is suboptimal. Distance has become too expensive. You check them more often, not because you expect better results, but because leaving them unchecked feels like wasted potential. Most of them come up empty. When meat does come, it is lean. Late-season animals carry less fat. Fat is what matters now. Protein feeds muscle, but fat feeds heat. Without it, your body burns itself to stay warm. You ration carefully, small portions spaced out. Enough to function, not enough to recover. Recovery would require surplus, and surplus no longer exists. This is how starvation begins in cold climates. Not with emptiness, but with imbalance. You are eating, but you are losing ground. As days pass, another pressure emerges: water. Snow is everywhere, but snow is work. Melting it requires fire. Fire requires wood. Wood requires time and energy. Streams that once ran shallow under ice are now locked solid. You find pockets of liquid water only where terrain allows it, south-facing slopes, narrow cuts, places that demand detours. You begin to melt snow more often, despite the cost. Each decision is reasonable. Each trade makes sense. Together, they form a loop that tightens daily. Your body responds predictably. Fingers lose precision. Toes stay numb longer after movement stops. Small cuts take longer to close. None of this is alarming yet. It is familiar. You have felt it before. What is different is the absence of recovery. There is no day where you wake warmer than the one before. No stretch where effort feels repaid. Each morning begins at a deficit. Men later described this winter not as harsh, but as flat, unchanging, a season without relief. That constancy was the danger. Without fluctuation, there was no signal to force decisive action, no storm dramatic enough to justify abandoning plans entirely. So men continued. They adjusted portions, they shortened routes, they lowered expectations. Lowering expectations is adaptive, until it isn't. Camps found later showed this progression clearly. Cooking fires reduced to the smallest viable size. Tools laid out carefully as if preparing for tomorrow's work that never came. Personal items set aside, not discarded, suggesting men still believed they would move on. You do too. You keep gear organized, you dry what can be dried, you plan tomorrow's route even as your confidence in it fades. Planning itself becomes a stabilizing ritual. It gives shape to uncertainty. But the land no longer responds. This is the third failure: feedback delay. In normal conditions, bad decisions produce fast consequences. You get wet, you get cold. You push too far, you collapse. Here, consequences lag. You can make a poor trade today and feel functional tomorrow. The cost arrives later when correction is no longer possible.
You are not lost, you are not panicking, you are not injured, and that is exactly why this is dangerous. The mountains have stopped negotiating. They are no longer hostile, but they are no longer generous. And survival now depends less on skill than on whether your remaining margins outlast the season. Many men assumed they would. Some of them were wrong.
The first thing to go is not strength, it is choice. You notice it when you stop debating options in the morning. There used to be decisions to weigh: push farther or hold, hunt here or shift ground, burn more wood now or save it for night. Those choices required thought, and thought implied flexibility. Now the day begins with fewer branches. You wake, assess the cold, and already know what you will do, not because it is optimal, but because it is the only thing that still fits within the limits of daylight, energy, and heat. The land has narrowed your decision tree without announcing that it has done so. This is how experienced men became predictable. Predictability is dangerous in an environment that no longer behaves as expected. You move shorter distances, hugging timber even when it slows you. Wind exposure costs too much. Open ground no longer tempts you, no matter how direct the route. Safety has become synonymous with familiarity, and familiarity is slowly becoming a trap. You reuse camps. Not the same shelter exactly, but the same type of ground, the same slope angles, the same tree density. Places that worked yesterday feel safer than unknown ground today. Exploration is a luxury now. This marks another shift. Risk tolerance collapses inward. In earlier winters, calculated risk was how men survived. You pushed into new drainages, tested routes, followed fresh sign even when it pulled you off plan. That flexibility is gone. The cost of being wrong has risen too high. So you stay close to what you know, and what you know is shrinking. You begin to feel the weight of your gear differently, not because it is heavier, but because you are no longer sure it is worth carrying all of it. Each item must justify its presence now, not in theory, but in daily return. You leave small things behind: a spare tool you rarely use, extra leather meant for repairs later, anything that does not serve an immediate function. This is rational. What is less obvious is what this reveals. You no longer expect the future to arrive intact. You are planning for fewer tomorrows, even if you do not consciously admit it. Camps found later often showed this pattern. Non-essential items neatly set aside rather than scattered. Order without optimism. Evidence of men thinking clearly, even as their margins collapsed. You still think clearly. That is the cruel part. The cold does not confuse you. Hunger does not yet dominate. You are not delirious. You are simply operating inside a system that has closed. Another subtle failure emerges: fire placement. You begin choosing shelter locations based less on wind and more on fuel proximity. A stand of timber close at hand matters more than optimal exposure. This makes sense. Carrying wood over distance is expensive. But this also ties you to terrain that others avoided for wintering. Low pockets where cold settles, shaded slopes where snow never softens, drainages that trap damp air. These places are survivable in short bursts. They are not forgiving over weeks. You compensate by burning more at night and less during the day. Nights are the danger window now. Daylight work keeps you warm. Darkness strips heat relentlessly. This inversion is correct, but it accelerates wood depletion. You begin to count nights instead of days. This is another psychological shift. Days imply action, nights imply endurance. When survival becomes about nights, the balance has tipped. Men later described winter camps where the fire was treated almost ceremonially, never allowed to die completely, carefully fed, watched, guarded. The fire became less a tool and more a boundary between living and not. You feel this change yourself.
You wake at night to check the coals, even when you know they're fine. You sleep lighter, not from fear, but from responsibility. Letting the fire fail would be catastrophic, and catastrophe now feels closer than it should. This vigilance costs rest. Rest is the one resource you cannot replace. By now, movement, hunting, and shelter have all adjusted to worse conditions. What has not adjusted is your belief that this is temporary. That belief persists longer than it should. You still think in terms of holding on until something shifts. Weather, game, a route opening, anything. But the season is not shifting, it is holding steady. This is what finally separates this winter from others. Not severity, but consistency. There is no reprieve to reset the system, no mild spell to rebuild surplus, no soft days to recover losses. Every day is close enough to manageable to continue, and every day leaves you slightly worse than the one before. This is how men arrived at spring with fewer tools, fewer fingers, fewer companions, and no clear memory of when survival turned into endurance. By the time that line was crossed, there was no clear way back, only forward into colder nights, narrower choices, and a fire that mattered more than anything else you owned.
At some point, you stop thinking of the landscape as neutral. That shift happens quietly. There is no single moment where the mountains turn hostile. Instead, you begin to read every feature in terms of extraction cost, not what it offers, but what it demands in return. A stand of timber is no longer wood. It is hours of cutting with stiff hands. A frozen creek is no longer water. It is fuel spent just to make it drinkable. A ridgeline is no longer a view. It is exposure, wind, and lost heat. This reframing is logical. It is also exhausting. You notice it when you hesitate before tasks that once felt automatic. You stand longer before committing to an action, mentally pricing it out. The work still gets done, but the pause is new. That pause signals something important. Your margin for error is gone. This is when isolation begins to matter. Mountain men often traveled alone or in loose association. That independence was a strength in most seasons. It allowed flexibility, speed, and discretion. In deep winter, it becomes a liability. There is no labor sharing now. Cutting wood, hauling it, tending fire, hunting, melting snow, every task draws from the same body. In a group, these costs can be distributed. Alone, they stack. Men who wintered successfully in other years often did so near others, even if loosely, not for companionship but for redundancy. Shared information, shared effort, shared failure. This season, many men were too spread out for that. You realize this when you find signs of others and feel relief rather than competition. Old tracks, a cut stump, a camp scar, proof that someone else is nearby or was recently. You do not find the person. That absence is unsettling, not because it implies death, though it might, but because it removes a variable. There is no one to compare notes with, no one to confirm whether conditions are normal or worsening. You are inside the system with no external reference. This amplifies a dangerous tendency, normalization of decline. Each day's losses become the baseline for the next. Slightly colder mornings feel ordinary, reduced rations feel prudent, slower movement feels responsible. You are adapting, but to a shrinking world. Later, men who survived described how quickly this became invisible. You do not notice the slope you are sliding down because the change is constant. There is no contrast to wake you. The body adapts too. Muscle mass reduces to lower energy demand, appetite dulls, shivering becomes more efficient but less effective. You feel used to the cold even as it eats away at reserves. This false adaptation is lethal. It convinces you that endurance is working. You begin to plan in shorter horizons, one day, one night, a single task.
Long-term goals dissolve, not because you abandoned them, but because they no longer fit the scale of decision-making. This is where many men misjudged their situation. They were not lost. They were not incapacitated. They were not starving outright. They were trapped in adequacy. Adequacy is dangerous because it delays action. As long as you are functioning, abandoning a plan feels premature. Dropping elevation further, burning emergency reserves, or taking risky routes all seem unjustified while the present remains barely tolerable. So you hold. Camps discovered later often showed evidence of this holding pattern. Extra shelters added rather than relocation attempted. Traps reset again and again in poor ground. Tools repaired meticulously as if maintenance itself might stabilize the situation. You do the same. You mend gear, you dry what little can be dried, you improve the shelter incrementally. These tasks feel productive, and they are, but they also anchor you to a position that may no longer be viable.
This is another systemic failure: investment inertia. The more effort you pour into a place, the harder it becomes to leave it, not emotionally, practically. Leaving means abandoning work already paid for in calories and heat. Staying feels like honoring that investment. In normal seasons, that instinct is sound. Here, it keeps you in shrinking margins. You notice your world getting smaller. The radius you travel contracts. Familiar paths get worn deeper into the snow. New ground goes unexplored. Unknowns feel too expensive. The fire still burns. You still eat. You still wake each morning. From the inside, this looks like survival. From the outside, it looks like a system slowly running out of options. Men who eventually escaped this winter often did so not because they were stronger or smarter, but because something forced a discontinuity. A storm that destroyed a camp, an injury that made holding impossible, a sudden absence of wood or water that collapsed the holding pattern. They were pushed into decisive movement. Those who were not pushed often stayed until movement itself became impossible. As night settles again, you tend the fire and watch the light pull inward around it. The darkness beyond no longer feels empty. It feels occupied by cold, by effort, by the quiet accumulation of cost. You are still alive, but now survival depends less on what you do next and more on whether the system you are inside can still produce a way out. The body begins to change its priorities before the mind accepts what that means. You notice it first in your hands. Not numbness, that came earlier, but a delay. You think about a movement, and the fingers respond a fraction later than they used to. Tasks that once flowed now arrive in steps. Grip, adjust, check. Nothing is wrong, exactly. Everything is just slower. Slowness is expensive. It stretches tasks across daylight you no longer have to spare. It increases exposure. It turns simple errors into compound ones. Dropping a tool now means bare fingers in snow longer than planned. Fumbling a knot costs more than patience. It costs heat. You compensate by simplifying. You choose methods that are less precise but faster. You cut corners that would have annoyed you in other seasons. The work still gets done, but with less margin built into it. Systems lose redundancy quietly, one shortcut at a time. This is when the body starts to ration core heat. Not consciously, automatically. Blood flow shifts inward. Extremities cool first. Toes, fingers, ears. This is normal. This is how cold survival works. But there is a threshold beyond which protection becomes damage. Tissue kept cold too long does not recover cleanly. You warm your hands more often now, even when it costs wood. You rotate tasks to keep blood moving. You stamp feet, swing arms, pace the perimeter of camp. These are not signs of panic, they are signs of maintenance. Maintenance keeps you functional. It does not restore you. Sleep changes too. You wake more frequently, not always knowing why. Sometimes it is the fire, sometimes it is the cold, sometimes it is simply the body checking in, making sure nothing critical has failed. Deep sleep becomes rare, light sleep becomes the norm. This matters more than it seems. Without deep rest, recovery stops. Muscle repair slows, immune response weakens. Small infections linger. Minor injuries stop resolving. Everything trends downward, slowly enough to ignore. Men later described feeling steady as their condition worsened. That steadiness was not strength, it was adaptation to decline. You still perform daily checks: fire, shelter, traps, gear. The list has not changed. What has changed is how much each task costs relative to what it returns.
The land continues to provide just enough to keep you engaged. A rabbit in a trap, a usable branch, a calm day with less wind. These small successes reinforce the belief that holding is still viable. They mask the underlying truth: you are no longer accumulating anything. No surplus, no buffer, no recovery window. Everything gained is immediately spent. This is the point at which many men unknowingly crossed from survival into attrition. They were not dying, they were being worn down. And wear does not announce itself. It feels like persistence, it feels like grit, it feels like doing what must be done. You notice another subtle shift. Your tolerance for cold increases, not because you are warmer, but because sensation dulls. Cold becomes background. Pain recedes into a constant presence rather than a signal. This is dangerous. Pain is information. When it fades, so does warning. Frostbite rarely feels dramatic at first. It feels like stiffness, like clumsiness, like nothing worth addressing yet. You delay intervention because intervention costs time and heat. This delay is rational until it isn't. Later accounts mention men discovering injuries only after thaw. Fingers blackened, toes gone. Damage done not by a single night, but by cumulative exposure that never quite crossed a threshold worth responding to. This winter was full of thresholds that were never crossed, only approached endlessly. Your sense of time compresses further. Days blur, not because they are eventless, but because they follow the same pattern. Wake, tend fire, work carefully, conserve, endure, sleep lightly, repeat. This repetition is stabilizing. It is also numbing. You stop expecting change, and that is when the most dangerous assumption takes hold, that the future will resemble the present closely enough to plan for. It won't. The body can absorb steady loss for a long time, longer than most people realize. But when it fails, it does so abruptly, not gradually. Systems that have been compensating suddenly cannot. Men found later were often positioned as if they had simply paused, sitting, lying down, tools nearby, no sign of struggle, no sign of panic, just a moment when compensation stopped working. You do not feel close to that moment yet. That is what makes it dangerous. As you tend the fire again and prepare for another night, you are still competent, still thinking, still choosing. But the choices available to you now exist within a much narrower band than before, and once that band collapses, there will be no warning loud enough to hear.
The decision to leave does not arrive as a decision. It arrives as a question you avoid answering. You think about moving lower, not dramatically lower, just enough to change conditions. You picture different timber, different snow, different wind. You have imagined this before many times, and each time you postponed it for reasons that were sound in isolation. The fire was stable, the shelter was serviceable, food was still coming, slowly. Leaving would mean exposure, unknown ground, risk without guarantee. Staying still felt safer, because staying still had not killed you yet. This is how the mind protects itself when options narrow. It reframes inaction as caution. But the mountains do not care how you frame it. What finally forces the issue is not a storm or a sudden disaster. It is a small failure that refuses to stay small. A fire that takes longer than it should to catch. A night where sleep never quite arrives. A morning where your hands ache before you expose them. You wake and realize you are colder than yesterday, before you move, before you spend energy. That should not happen. Cold should be something you earn through effort or neglect. When it arrives unearned, it means reserves are gone. This is the moment men later struggled to describe because it did not feel like panic. It felt like clarity. You begin to inventory not what you have, but what you can afford to lose. This is a different calculation than before. Earlier you trimmed weight and effort. Now you prepare for abandonment. Not consciously, not fully, but in how you think. You set aside items that no longer justify their cost, a tool you might need later, extra leather, anything that assumes a future beyond immediate movement. This is not despair, it is alignment. Your body has already accepted what your mind is just beginning to process. Holding position is no longer sustainable. The question is not whether to move, but how much risk movement can absorb. Men who survived this phase often did so by breaking one of their own rules. They burned more wood than they should have to warm fully before leaving. They traveled in worse conditions than they would normally accept. They abandoned investments they had worked hard to build. From the outside, these choices looked reckless. From the inside, they were corrections. You prepare to move at first light, not with urgency, but with care. Urgency wastes heat. Care preserves it. You lay out what you will carry, what you will leave, and how far you can reasonably go before stopping. You plan shorter distances than you would like. That is realism, not weakness. You choose routes that prioritize shelter over speed, timber over open ground, known ground over ideal ground. Still, this movement costs more than expected. Snow resists you with a stubbornness that feels personal. Each step sinks, not deeply enough to stop you, but enough to tax muscles already operating below capacity. You move slowly, deliberately, conserving balance and breath. This is when you begin to feel the consequences of long-term attrition. Your legs are strong enough, but they do not rebound the way they used to. Muscles fatigue faster and recover slower. Small stumbles feel heavier. Corrections cost more effort. You stop more often than planned. Each stop steals heat. You compensate by keeping stops brief, by working while resting, by refusing stillness. You cut branches, adjust gear, stamp feet. Stillness feels dangerous now. It feels like surrender, even though you know it is not. You descend gradually toward lower timber. The change is subtle. Snow depth eases slightly. Wind shifts. The air feels marginally heavier, less sharp. These are good signs, but they are not enough yet. You find a place to camp that evening that you would have rejected earlier in the season. Too damp, too enclosed, too dependent on nearby fuel. But now it offers something else, reduced exposure. You build quickly, not perfectly. Perfection is expensive. Function is sufficient.
As you tend the fire, you realize how much of your identity has been tied to competence, to doing things correctly, to surviving by skill rather than chance. That identity has taken small hits over the past weeks, compromises made, standards lowered. But this is the first time you feel it shift fundamentally. Survival is no longer about mastery. It is about allowing the system to change. Men who died often clung to the idea that the mountains would eventually return to normal behavior, that patience would be rewarded, that endurance alone was enough. Men who lived accepted something harder, that the system they trusted had ended, and a new one, worse, narrower, less forgiving, had replaced it. Acceptance did not make the work easier. It made it possible. You eat that night and feel the food settle heavily. Digestion costs heat you can barely spare, but you cannot move without fuel. Everything is a trade now, explicit and unavoidable. Sleep comes in fragments. You wake often, checking the fire, adjusting position, listening to the silence beyond the shelter. The mountains sound the same as they always have, and that sameness is unsettling. It offers no feedback, no reassurance. Morning arrives gray and still. You rise slower than before, not from pain, but from calculation. Standing too quickly makes you dizzy now. You wait for the sensation to pass. This is new. You note it, but do not dwell. Dwelling solves nothing. Today you will move again. Not far, not fast, but enough. This is the rhythm now. Controlled retreat, measured exposure, deliberate abandonment of what once felt essential. Somewhere beyond the timber and snow, there is ground that still offers margin. Lower valleys, river bottoms, places where winter loosens its grip just enough to allow recovery. Reaching them will require effort you are no longer certain you can afford, but staying will cost you more. And for the first time since the winter began, that equation is clear.
Movement stops being something you plan and becomes something you negotiate. Each morning now begins with an assessment that feels more medical than strategic. You check yourself the way you check the land. Fingers flexed one by one, toes wiggled inside stiff boots before you commit weight to them. Breath measured, not for comfort, but for steadiness. If the body hesitates, the day must adapt. This is new territory. In earlier seasons, the body followed decisions. Now, decisions follow the body. You move down slope again, choosing contours that trade distance for shelter. You read the timber not for abundance, but for continuity. Stretches where you can move without breaking into open wind, where the snow lies in familiar drifts rather than deceptive crusts. You avoid the clean lines of ridges and the tempting shortcuts of frozen flats. Those places demand speed. You can no longer pay for speed. Travel takes most of the daylight, not because the distance is great, but because every action must be done deliberately. You stop before you need to. You drink before thirst becomes insistent. You correct small problems early, tightening bindings, adjusting loads, because fixing them later will cost more. This caution is wise. It is also costly. By midday, you recognize the pattern that now defines your days. You spend more energy preventing loss than creating gain. The effort goes into keeping the situation from worsening rather than improving it. That is maintenance, not progress. Progress would mean surplus. You do not have surplus. You find sign and follow it only briefly. The ground suggests a possibility. Tracks angled down slope, spaced in a way that implies a moving animal rather than a feeding one. You consider the pursuit and stop yourself. The return is uncertain, the cost is not. This refusal would have bothered you earlier in the season. Passing up an opportunity felt like negligence. Now it feels disciplined. You are protecting the system by not testing it. Later you will wonder how many men made the opposite choice. How many followed sign just one time too many, trusting that skill would compensate for circumstance? How many burned daylight and heat for a chance that no longer balanced the ledger? You do not follow. Instead, you keep moving. Lower elevation brings small mercies. Snow thins in places. The air loses some of its edge. You find water not entirely locked beneath ice, moving slowly in shadowed bends. Melting snow becomes occasional rather than constant. Each of these changes helps, but they do not reverse what has already happened. Your body has been drawing down reserves for too long. This is where many men misread recovery. They felt a little better and assumed the trend would continue. They ate and expected warmth to return. They slept and expected strength to rebound. When it didn't,
They blamed the night, the food, the shelter, anything but the cumulative loss already incurred. Recovery requires more than relief. It requires margin. You make camp again in a place that would have seemed marginal before, but now feels carefully chosen. The slope breaks the wind. Timber is close enough to work without long carries. The ground drains well enough to keep damp from creeping in overnight. You build with efficiency rather than thoroughness. No extra layers, no improvements that assume you will stay longer than necessary. Everything you do is oriented toward tomorrow, not the week ahead. This shift matters.
Men who survived this winter often stopped trying to solve it. They stopped treating it as a problem with a fix and began treating it as a condition to be navigated. That change in framing altered their behavior in subtle but decisive ways. They traveled lighter. They committed less. They allowed themselves to abandon ground without resentment. Resentment is expensive. It keeps you tied to decisions that no longer serve you. As night settles, you notice another quiet change. Your tolerance for discomfort has peaked. What once registered as bearable now registers as threatening. This is not fear, it is recalibration. Your system is narrowing its acceptable range, not because you were weaker, but because the consequences of error have grown. You feed the fire more generously than you have in days. This is a deliberate violation of your earlier discipline. You burn wood you would normally save because you understand something now that you did not before. A warm night can restore function in ways food cannot. Heat allows sleep. Sleep allows repair. Repair keeps you mobile. Men who died often conserved fire too long. They protected tomorrow at the expense of tonight, not realizing that tonight was the gatekeeper of all tomorrows. You sit close to the flame and let the heat reach you properly, not just at the hands, but through the core. You eat slowly, allowing the body to process without shock. You drink until you are no longer rationing out of habit. These choices feel indulgent. They are not. They are corrective. Sleep comes heavier than it has in a while. Still broken, still light, but deeper in its fragments. You wake fewer times. When you do, the fire still lives. That matters more than you would have believed earlier in the season. Morning arrives with a subtle difference. You are not warm, but you are less cold. That distinction is important. Your hands work a little better. The delay between thought and action shortens. Standing does not produce the same brief dizziness. These are not victories, they are indicators, signals that the system can still respond if given the right inputs. This is when survival becomes tactical again. Not hopeful, not optimistic, but responsive. You pack with intention and leave the camp without ceremony. No improvements left unfinished, no tools cached. You assume nothing about returning. This assumption frees you. As you move, you begin to recognize a new danger. Not the cold, not hunger, but false stabilization. The temptation to believe that small improvements mean the crisis has passed. Men who made it through the worst weeks often fell later when they relaxed too soon. You do not relax. You keep moving lower. You accept that the system you trusted before is gone. In its place is something narrower and harsher, but also more honest. It tells you exactly what it can support, and no more. If you listen closely enough, it will not lie. The mountains do not reward hope. They reward alignment. And alignment now means one thing above all others: staying mobile long enough for the margins to return. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon enough, if nothing else breaks first. By now, survival is no longer something you pursue. It is something you maintain, moment by moment, through constant correction. The land below the high country begins to open in subtle ways. Not wide, not generous, but less restrictive. Snow thins where the ground absorbs more sun. Drainages cut deeper and hold water longer before freezing. Wind loses some of its authority, moving higher, less intent on stripping heat from anything that moves. These changes do not feel like rescue. They feel like permission. Permission to pause without penalty. Permission to sleep without debt. Permission to make a mistake that does not immediately cascade. You move carefully through this altered landscape, aware that improvement is fragile. The margin you have gained is thin and easily squandered. You resist the urge to press harder just because conditions allow it. That urge has killed men before. Instead, you pace the recovery. This is another discipline many did not recognize in time. After prolonged deprivation, the body cannot absorb sudden abundance efficiently. Eating too much at once steals heat. Pushing too far on a good day creates exhaustion that the next day cannot repay. So you move modestly. You stop earlier than necessary. You eat more regularly, not more heavily. You keep the fire alive longer than feels economical. These choices slow progress, but they rebuild function. You feel it in small ways first. Hands that no longer ache constantly, feet that regain sensation sooner after stopping, breathing that settles instead of racing when you lift your pack. These are not comforts. They are indicators that the downward curve has flattened. Flattening the curve is victory now. You think, briefly, about other men, not abstractly, but concretely, about those who wintered not far from where you were, men you may have crossed paths with in better seasons, men whose systems broke in the same ways yours nearly did. You understand now how they were lost without drama. You imagine a man staying one more day because the fire was good, another conserving wood because tomorrow might be colder, another following sign because skill had always compensated before. You imagine them thinking clearly, acting rationally, and still failing. That knowledge does not frighten you. It humbles you. Survival, you see now, is not a reward for competence. It is an outcome of alignment between body, behavior, and conditions. When that alignment breaks, experience becomes irrelevant. As days pass, the routine shifts again. Hunting becomes marginally more productive, not abundant, but predictable. Animals move more consistently at lower elevations. Fat content improves. The calories you gain begin to exceed what you immediately spend. This is the first surplus you have felt in weeks. You do not celebrate it. Celebration implies security. Security invites waste. Instead, you quietly rebuild. You dry meat properly. You render what fat you can. You sleep longer. You let the body settle into warmth without constantly interrupting it. This restraint matters.
Men who survived prolonged cold often fell during recovery. They overestimated how quickly strength returned. They assumed that once danger passed, they could resume normal patterns. Normal no longer exists. You remain cautious. Even now, you plan with the assumption that conditions could reverse. You avoid committing to places that trap you. You favor routes that allow retreat. You keep fire-making materials accessible at all times. These habits have been burned into you. They will not leave easily. You find signs of others again, not old signs, but recent ones. A cut branch with sap not yet frozen hard, tracks that have not yet softened or drifted over, a fire scar that still smells faintly of smoke. You do not rush toward them. Contact is complex now. Another man represents shared labor and shared knowledge, but also shared scarcity. You weigh the options carefully, the way everything must now be weighed. Later accounts from survivors describe this hesitation clearly. Winter changed how men related to one another. Cooperation was valuable,
but only if systems aligned. Otherwise, it accelerated collapse. You move on. Not out of distrust, out of caution. The world you are emerging into is not the one you entered the winter with. It is leaner, quieter, less forgiving, but it is also more legible. The signals are clearer now. When something costs too much, you feel it immediately. This clarity is the final adaptation. You no longer confuse endurance with progress. You no longer mistake habit for wisdom. You no longer assume tomorrow will resemble yesterday. When spring eventually announces itself, not dramatically, but with longer light and softer mornings, you will still be alive to notice it. Many were not. When men finally gathered again at trading posts and river camps, the winter was discussed cautiously. No one framed it as a single disaster. There was no story to tell that fit neatly around a storm or a date. Instead, there were fragments. Men who did not arrive, men who arrived altered, men who arrived missing pieces of themselves. The lessons were not written down. They were carried forward quietly, folded into new habits, new rules, new superstitions about when to leave high country and when to stop trusting what had worked before. You carry those lessons now. They have reshaped how you read cold, how you value movement, how you judge risk. You will never again assume that survival is guaranteed by experience alone. As you move through this lower, more forgiving terrain, you understand something fundamental about the winter you endured. It did not kill through violence. It killed through delay. Delay in recognition, delay in correction, delay in abandoning systems that no longer fit reality. You lived because, eventually, you stopped waiting for the system to recover and began rebuilding yourself inside a different one. That difference is small, and it is everything.
Survival does not end when the danger passes. It ends much later, when the body finally believes that it no longer needs to defend itself. You do not notice that moment when it happens. There is no line in the snow where endurance becomes safety. The mountains loosen their grip gradually, and you loosen yours just as slowly. Habit outlives necessity. It always does. Even now, as daylight stretches and mornings arrive with less resistance, you wake before you need to. You check the fire even when the night was mild. You eat cautiously, spacing meals as if scarcity might return at any moment. Your body remembers. This is the final cost of that winter, not the cold, not the hunger, but the recalibration of normal. Men who came out of that season were not simply thinner or slower. They were altered in how they evaluated risk. They moved differently through space. They trusted fewer assumptions. They abandoned places earlier. They left high country sooner. They no longer waited for proof that conditions had turned lethal. They acted on trend, not crisis. That is the lesson that survived. When you eventually reach others, trading posts, river bottoms, seasonal camps, the conversations are restrained. No one boasts, no one dramatizes. The men who talk the least are often the ones who lost the most. Names come up and are left hanging. Someone mentions a camp that never reappeared. Someone else recalls tracks that ended without explanation. Someone avoids a familiar route entirely without saying why. No one needs to argue about what happened. The evidence is embodied in missing fingers, in altered gait, in eyes that assess weather longer than necessary. The winter did not create heroes. It created filters. Those who survived did not do so because they were stronger, braver, or smarter in any absolute sense. They survived because at some point they abandoned a working identity. They stopped trying to be experienced mountain men. They became adaptive systems instead. This distinction matters. Experience relies on repetition. It assumes that patterns recur with enough consistency to be trusted. Adaptation does not.
It assumes that patterns can break and prepares to move when they do. That winter exposed the danger of expertise untempered by humility. The men who died were not foolish. They were often skilled, disciplined, methodical. They did many things right. What they could not accept until it was too late was that the environment had shifted outside the bounds of their accumulated knowledge. They waited for confirmation. The winter never gave it. You did not survive because you predicted the outcome. You survived because you eventually stopped waiting to be certain. That is a subtle distinction, but it defines everything. Long after the snow retreats, after rivers run free and passes reopen, you still feel the echo of that season in small choices. You camp with exits in mind. You build shelters as if you might leave them unfinished. You value warmth at night over progress during the day. You no longer optimize for efficiency alone. You optimize for recoverability. That principle, rarely spoken, rarely taught, became one of the quiet inheritances of that winter. It passed not through journals or manuals, but through behavior, through how men packed, moved, and chose when to stop. Later generations would benefit from this without knowing why. Routes shifted, timelines changed, rules hardened around when to descend and when to abandon ground. The winter faded into memory, but its logic embedded itself into practice.
That is how history actually persists, not as stories, but as constraints that outlive their origin. You walk now through a landscape that feels open again. The danger has retreated, but it has not vanished. It never does. It waits for assumptions to reform, for habits to harden, for experience to become complacency. You know better now. Not because you were wiser, but because you have seen what happens when systems fail quietly. The mountains look the same as they always have. Timber rises, snow melts, wind moves on. Nothing about them announces what they are capable of. They do not need to. They have already taught you the only lesson that mattered. Survival is not about enduring conditions. It is about recognizing when the rules you were using no longer apply and having the discipline to change them before the cost becomes irreversible. That winter did not make you invincible. It made you accurate. And in the mountains, accuracy is what keeps you alive.